So my name is Jessie. I oversee customer education at Ramp. And today is our lucky day. We actually have another Ramp colleague on the line. So if you have any questions as I'm going through today's content, feel free to drop those into the chat and Ayana will be happy to help answer those. So like I mentioned, we'll be starting in the in-app setup guide. So I'll start by sharing my screen. And when we're looking at the in-app setup guide, you'll notice that if I go into the left-hand navigation bar, it's going to be all the way at the top and it's going to be a button. So you'll actually see this button by default for the first 60 days post-approval. If you're past that 60-day window, absolutely no need to worry. I always like to tell my webinar attendees a little backdoor hack. So if you put this snippet at the end of your URL, you can actually still get to the in-app setup guide even if you're past that 60-day window. So a big reason why I like to start my sessions out with showing this is you'll notice that it breaks down the various steps that you need to take in order to have a successful implementation with Ramp. So for example, if I look at what I need to do under creating a control, the first step is review approval workflows. So before I do this, let's click into Learn More, and you'll notice that it opens a window on the right-hand side. So this window is going to contain not only how to do this within Ramp, but it'll also walk you through why you should be doing this and some best practices for doing it along the way. So once you're ready to actually get there within Ramp, you can do so by clicking Get Started, or you can actually click into the task name to get there directly within Ramp. So you'll notice that as you complete tasks in Ramp, those will become crossed out, and you can always notice your progress reflected via this counter up at the top. So the reason why I like to start my sessions out by calling this out is, as, a customer education manager, I do a ton of work into looking at, okay, which customers are maximizing those time and money savings within Ramp, and how can we distribute those to our broader customer base? And so you'll find those best practices in this in-app setup guide. So you don't need to interact with this. If you do, you don't need to be at 100%. But, as you get closer to 100% or when you near 100%, that's when you're really going to be maximizing those time and money savings. And I know that's top of mind for a lot of folks in the new year. I know at Ramp, that's definitely top of mind for us. So that's why I always like to start my sessions out by calling this out. So now we'll go back into that left-hand navigation bar. Now let's click into Bill Pay. So it's going to be about halfway down. So before we dive into Bill Pay, let's just take a step back and go through, okay, what does Bill Pay even really entail? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page on today's call. So Ramp Bill Pay makes it easy for you to pay your bills via card, ACH, physical check, or even international wire with just a few clicks. This helps you manage all of your spend in one place, but also really helps from a forecasting perspective. So now let's click into settings and let's actually get Bill Pay set up. So first in settings, you'll notice that we have general. And so this is where you'll choose your verified ACH account. You'll notice that it's pulling in accounts that I've already verified. And so now I'll just click this toggle. You'll notice that the next step is prompting me to select my QuickBooks Cashback account. So I've already selected mine, but if you need to use a different account, you will need to verify it first with Ramp. You'll notice that we've added a little button at the bottom here to make it easy to get there within Ramp. To the right of that, we'll look at people. And so we have the AP clerk. So the default setting with Ramp Bill Pay is that admins and owners have access to be able to go in, they can create bills, they can edit bills, they can kick off approval processes, and they can release funds. So admins and owners are able to do anything and everything within Bill Pay. With that being said, that can be a lot of work for one or even a handful of people. And so this is where AP clerks come into play. This is definitely, I like to call it a hidden gem feature. What you can do is you can add a standard user. So you can add an employee, you can add a card manager or a bookkeeper in as an AP clerk. And these people will help keep bills moving along the way. So they can go in, they can view bills, they can create new bills, they can edit bills, and even kick off the approval process for bills. With that being said, there are still some guardrails. Admins and owners are still the only people who can actually release the funds. So these people can basically tee it up and get it moving along the way. But when we think about getting it to the finish line, that's still going to be admins and owners. So you might want to, in this case, we'll select Linda. And you'll notice that I can select people by clicking on that line and then either typing their name or selecting them from the dropdown. To the right of that, we have approvals. And so if you've set up card requests or card approvals or reimbursement request for approvals, you'll notice that this looks pretty similar. So in this case, the default setting is that any bill, regardless of the amount, will always require any admin to actually approve that bill. So what I recommend doing here, and it's a little bit different, but bear with me, is let's have a really small amount here. So let's say if the amount is greater than or equal to $100, now in our first step, let's add the vendor owner in as an approver. So we'll cover the vendor owner shortly in greater detail, but at a high level, you'll need to indicate a vendor owner when you're adding a vendor to Ramp. So that's the person at Ramp or at your organization, in this case, Ramp, but it's the individual at your organization who is responsible for that vendor relationship. So it's helpful to add them into the approval process early on at a very low amount because it's the individual from your team will be able to say, yes, this invoice is legitimate and should be paid, or no, this is not a legitimate invoice, do not pay this. So it's really helpful to add them in, like I mentioned early on. So that's why I recommend doing so with a small limit. In this case, we're saying $100. Now we'll add another step and let's still require any admin. And just like with our other approval workflows, we can click into where it has require, and now we can select notify from the dropdown. So the big difference between these two is require indicates this person needs to actually approve this, or they can reject it, but they need to do something. Whereas notify means this person actually doesn't need to approve it. They don't need to reject it. They just want to be kept in the loop. And so now under notify, we might select one of our bookkeepers. Let's select Mary and Megan. You'll notice that when setting up approval workflows, you can always move steps up or down based on the arrows. And now we can press create layer. So you'll notice now that any bill below $1 or $100 only requires any admin to approve it, but any bill greater than $100 will first require that vendor owner to actually approve it, basically saying, yes, this is legitimate, or they can reject it and say, nope, we don't know what this is. This is a very creative scam, and that's going to help you avoid fraudulent payments. So now that we've set up settings, let's first go back into this left-hand navigation bar and let's go through the different tabs in Bill Pay. So first we have the Drafts tab. And so this is where your unscheduled and unapproved invoices will live. So think of the Drafts tab as a tab where basically you just want to get it out of the Drafts tab. This is your actionable tab. So anytime you see a bill in the Drafts tab, you basically want to go in, click into the bill, and either kick off the approval process, or you might want to delete that draft, etc. But you want to do something. You don't want bills lingering in the Drafts tab. So now let's click into the Approval tab. And so when we're looking at the Approval tab, this is where your scheduled invoices that are still awaiting approvals will live. So bills will not ever be sent for payment until every single approver has approved that. Let's retry this. There we go. Sorry about that. I live in the Bay Area and we've been having storms. So thank you everyone for bearing with me. But like I was saying, the Approvals tab is where scheduled invoices that are still awaiting approvals will live. So funds will never be released for payment until the bill has received all necessary approvals. So this is where you can check in and see, okay, who's next for approvals? How many people do we have who need to approve this? And when is the bill due date? Next, we have the Payments tab, and this is where your bills live that have been scheduled. They've received all the approvals. You're basically just waiting for that due date. So as soon as the bill due date rolls around, that bill, will be good to go. The funds will be released for payment, but you're just waiting for that date. And then lastly, we have the Paid tab. So this is the historical tab. You can go in and see when you paid vendors, how much you paid, how you paid, and all of that information. So this again is the historical tab. So now we'll go back into the Drafts tab. And so you'll notice that when looking at the Drafts tab, we have the option to create your first bill. Or if I click back into those three dots, you'll notice that I can either bulk upload bills or I can start by adding a new vendor. And so what I would recommend doing is I would recommend adding a new vendor. So you can add a new vendor to Ramp either before you upload the bill or after you upload the bill. So in this case, we'll start by uploading this before we upload the bill. So for the QuickBooks vendor, let's first start, and let's say that we're adding LinkedIn Recruiter. And so when we're looking at LinkedIn Recruiter, you'll notice that I can either select to add it to Ramp, or I also have the option to create LinkedIn Recruiter in QuickBooks. So if you are using QuickBooks as your team's ERP, you can actually add the vendor in QuickBooks as you're adding it to Ramp. If you're using another ERP, you will still need to go in and add that in your team's ERP. So in this case, since we are using QuickBooks, let's select Create Vendor in QuickBooks. So you'll notice that it's showing me new, and we can see that Ramp is creating this vendor in QuickBooks as we're creating this in Ramp. Next, we have the QuickBooks category. So this is the default category for this vendor. So all line items will always be defaulted to this category. You can always change the category on the individual line item. This is simply setting a default. So in this case, we might say job expenses. Under the vendor type, you'll notice that this is defaulted to business. If you are working with an individual, you can select individual from the dropdown, but for the purpose of this, we'll just leave this as business. Next, we have the country. So this is where your vendor is based. So Ramp actually supports working with global vendors. So in this case, LinkedIn is based in the United States, but let's say that it was based elsewhere. What I would do is I would select the country from the dropdown. Ramp can pay global vendors. So you can pay them. We support international wire transfer sent over the SWIFT network. That's going to be a $20 flat fee in order to send that international payment. But it makes it really easy to pay your vendors on time. You can still, pay them. It's one less thing to worry about. And we have really competitive exchange rates within Ramp. Next, we'll select the vendor owner. And so if we think back to the approval process that we just set up for bills, you'll remember that anytime a bill is greater than $100, we've actually added the vendor owner in to that approval process. So this is where you will want to put who manages that vendor relationship within Ramp. So in this case, for LinkedIn Recruiter, Mary Brown is our head of recruiting. She oversees that relationship. And so Mary is who we will add as our vendor owner. Next, we have contract start date. So let's say that this started the 1st of this year and ends the 21st. Or the 31st, sorry, wow. I was looking at the 2 for December. So this adds 31st or ends the 31st. And now we'll add the contact information. So for every single vendor, you will need to have at least one contact. This is helpful for a few different reasons. One, we'll actually just send them an email and let them know, hey, this payment is on the way. But two, if you're missing key information from the vendor, so let's say I wanted to pay LinkedIn via ACH, but I didn't have the routing or account numbers, Ramp can actually reach out to LinkedIn on your behalf. We would reach out to the contact person here. In addition, if you want to pay by physical check and don't have the mailing address, you can have Ramp reach out via this method as well. So in this case, we'll say Robert, add in Robert's email and contact phone. If you want to add in multiple vendor contacts, you can do that here. You could always just click this delete icon. Scrolling down, you'll notice that if you have information around ACH or physical check, mailing for a physical check, you can add that here, or you can just press create vendor. So it's pretty easy to actually go in and create the vendor in Ramp. And like I mentioned, you can do that either before uploading the bill or you can do it as you're uploading the bill. So we just went through what it looks like before you upload the bill. So now let's take a look at what it looks like when you're actually creating your first bill. So in order to populate this screen, I can either click on create your first bill, or I can just drag and drop an invoice into this screen. So I'll just drag and drop my invoice. You'll notice that it's uploading. And now I can see that Ramp is processing this bill. So I can see that it's processing. And now I can click in and see information around that bill. So when I'm looking at the invoice, the first thing that I notice is going to be this window on the right. And so this is letting me know that Ramp is still processing this invoice. So Ramp's OCR software is going to look at the invoice image and pull key information from that invoice. So if you've ever actually texted a picture of a receipt to Ramp, you've already interacted with this software. So a best practice here is Ramp is able to get most of the information in the first couple of minutes. What I would do is I would personally upload my bills either before lunch or at the end of the day. If you give Ramp 60 minutes, we're able to pull 99% of the information out for you. So it's just less work to do. So I would probably recommend doing it right before I'm about to be off my computer for a little bit. You'll notice that you can still work even though Ramp is processing that invoice. So the first step is, who is this bill for? So it's saying LinkedIn. And if you remember, we just added LinkedIn Recruiter, but we did not add LinkedIn. So in this case, it's saying this looks like a new vendor to us. Is this your first time paying this vendor on Ramp? So now in this case, we'll click yes, add to Ramp. We're adding the QuickBooks vendor and it's an existing vendor, so it was able to map it for us. Now we'll select our category. We'll do job expenses, and we'll go through a similar process to what we just went through. So like I mentioned, you can add the vendor either before uploading the bill or after. We'll go through, we'll add our vendor owner, our start and end date, our contact. So we'll still use Robert, our good old friend at LinkedIn. And then we'll scroll down. We don't need to add any of this information just yet until we'll press create vendor. So you'll notice that it's the same workflow, just a little bit different on how you end up there to add the vendor. So now when we're looking at this, first we can see no previous payments to this vendor. If you had ever paid the vendor in the past, we would show you historical data below. And now Ramp is able to pull these key piece of information out. So we've pulled the invoice number, the invoice date, and the bill due date. Anytime Ramp is able to populate information based on extracting it, so when our OCR software is working, you can always see what was filled via this lightning bolt. So in this case, we filled the invoice number, the invoice date, and the bill due date. If you'd like to add in the location or description, you can do so below. And now we have our line items. And so first, you'll notice that right now it's looking as one line item. You can always add another line item to split these out. So in this case, I might say for this first one, we'll do 10,000. Looks like this was job posting. Since this was a job posting, we might say actually, maybe this was advertising. We're advertising for a job. So you'll notice that I can split these out. Now I'll say 5,000. We'll do custom content. Maybe we'll do dues and subscriptions. You can always go and split these out. If you want to move them back to a single line item, you can just click the trash icon and consolidate those. Next, we have the payment type. And so with Ramp, you have a variety of different ways to pay your vendors. So the beauty is you can pay your vendors however it works best for your team. So first, you'll notice that you can either pay now or in 30, 60, or 90 days. So if having upfront capital is helpful to you, feel free to check out and apply for Ramp Flex if you haven't already done so. What it does is it allows you to pay your vendors either in 30, 60, or 90 days using Ramp Flex. You're able to basically take out a loan from Ramp, pay your vendors, and then pay Ramp back once you start to see that revenue. If you are paying via Ramp Flex, you can pay via ACH or international wire. You'll notice that you can also just pay those if you're not using Ramp Flex. So if you want to just pay now, you can still pay via ACH or international wire. Like I mentioned, international wires are sent via the SWIFT network, and so there is going to be a $20 flat fee. You can also pay via a physical check by mail or two different options for using a Ramp card. So you can either pay with a one-time virtual card or an existing Ramp card. If it were me, a general best practice I would recommend here is one, paying with Ramp cards is great because you get the cash back. That adds up pretty substantially, pretty quickly, especially when paying bills. So if you are paying with a Ramp card, I would recommend selecting one-time virtual card. The reason being, Ramp will create a one-time card specifically for this invoice. So the card name will be the invoice number as well as the vendor name. That card will be auto-locked until this bill has received all necessary approvals. As soon as the bill is sent for payment, once that payment has been received, the card will actually auto-lock. So it's going to create a card with the specific total for the invoice. It's going to be locked up until the payment is sent. And then as soon as the payment is sent, it's immediately locked again. So it's a really hassle-free way of paying with a Ramp card. Really just saves you time down the line, and you get that awesome 1.5% cash back. If you'd like to send the vendor a memo, you can do so here. And then scrolling down, you'll be able to see who this bill needs to be approved by and who will be notified. So now you can press review. You'll have the opportunity to take one last look. So like I mentioned, paying with a one-time virtual card will generate a card where it'll have the invoice number and the vendor name. And then you can send this for approval. So you'll notice that as soon as I sent that bill for approval, we're no longer seeing that in the drafts tab. Now we're seeing it in the approvals tab. So we can see, okay, Mary Brown is next to approve. Looks like she's one of two. I can click into this bill and see, okay, what's the payment status? What's the desired payment date? In this case, I'm using an invoice from the previous year. And so we're actually able to see, hey, this is already overdue. We got to get a move on this and pay this. If you ever want to edit the bill, so let's say I wanted to edit and say, actually, instead of paying via a card, let's scroll down into payment details, and now let's select ACH. You'll notice that first, we can say, okay, since this is overdue, let's manually initiate this payment. So let's say this should be sent tomorrow. The vendor receives it on the 25th. A good best practice here is to allow at least 5 business days. And I would say if you're paying via physical check, paying via ACH, or paying via international wire, I would recommend 6 business days at minimum. Those payments can take anywhere from 1 to 6 business days, but just to ensure that you don't incur late fees, I would bake in 6 business days. And so now when I press review changes, again, we'll send this for approval, and this is going to kick it back to the first stage of the approval process. So if you upload a bill, you will, and if you were to edit it after it's been uploaded, any edits would kick it back to the first stage of the approval process. So now looking back at the drafts tab, one thing I want to call out is you'll notice that at the bottom, we have this section for new invoices. You can either drag the invoices onto this email or onto this page, or you can just forward the emails to a specific email address. So every single Ramp customer will get a specific email address for bill forwarding. This is really helpful because any bills that you forward to this email address, the next time you log in, you'll actually see those as drafts in Ramp. So, a little pro tip at the bottom is if your company is an AP email, you can actually auto forward them to the address above. So, now let's look at uploading a new bill. And we'll go back to the same exact invoice that we just looked at. So, if I pull up that invoice, we'll drop it back in. You'll notice again that Ramp's OCR software is working. We can see who this bill is for. So we can see the vendor name, contact, and then the previous invoice. So this is where you'll be able to see the historical data. So we can see information and click into that invoice. Oops. Let's click out of this. So now let's go back and let's actually kickstart that. Apologies, I clicked the wrong thing. So now let's re-upload that invoice. And like I mentioned, you will be able to see the historical information. You can always click in and see what that invoice is. But if you accidentally upload an invoice that you've already uploaded to Ramp before, Ramp is actually going to call it out. We're going to say, this invoice has already been used. Make sure that you're not paying twice. View this bill and we'll hyperlink to that bill. So we'll still go through the same process. You can still say, okay, invoice date, bill due date, line items, payment details. Let's just do ACH. One thing I want to call out on this page is that if you are paying via ACH, you'll notice that you can indicate if it's a recurring bill. So if you have a recurring bill within Ramp, you can actually add that and say, okay, this happens monthly on the 24th, ends after a year. You can see when all of those payments will be sent. If you want to require approvals for recurring bills in the series, you can enable this. The default setting with recurring bills is that once you upload the first invoice and get all the necessary approvals, it's going to just honor those necessary approvals and you won't need to go through that approval process again. If you'd like your team to continue going through that approval process every month or, depending on the timing, every set number of days, you can toggle this on here. So scrolling down, we'll be able to see which account we're paying from, where we're sending payments to. Ramp will recognize if timing is ever tight. Now we can press review. You'll notice that once again, Ramp is recognizing, hey, this looks like a duplicate payment. Make sure that you're not paying twice. So we do have a few guardrails built in throughout Ramp so that we get it, we're all human, but we really try to proactively help you avoid those human error mistakes. So if you are trying to upload a duplicate invoice, we really try to make sure that you're not accidentally paying your vendors twice. So in order to pay this, I would need to actually physically override this and say, nah, looks good. Now I can go through and I can send this for approval. So we do show quite a bit of information here. We're seeing the one on the drafts. Now we can see the approvals. We still don't see anything in payments. So we're still waiting on Mary to approve both of these, but now we can look at the drafts tab. So with Ramp Bill Pay, what I would recommend doing, I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of our email address functionality here. It's just one last thing to worry about. You're already looking at the invoice in your inbox, most likely, or some team member is. And so just forwarding them to Ramp makes it so much easier because then when you log in, you already have your drafts populated. Now you can just click in and see, okay, Ramp has retrieved data from this invoice and pre-filled this for us. Beautiful. We can see the information, the invoice number, and now we can just simplify this. You'll notice that Ramp is allowing us to collapse line items. It makes it a lot easier to actually interact with bill pay. In addition, if you are uploading multiple bills to Ramp, take advantage of our bulk upload bills option. What it's going to do is it's going to open up your Finder app on your MacBook or where all your documents housed. Then from there, you can just bulk select. And lastly, I would just recommend, taking advantage of the various tabs in here. You will always be able to see if a bill is awaiting your approval, but feel free to just go around in here. It'll give you great visibility. So even when looking at this approvals tab, I can see the vendor name and the amount. You'll notice that this indicates if it's a recurring bill, and this indicates that it is not. Now we can see Mary is next to approve these. We have the payment date, the bill due date, the invoice date, the invoice number. We can actually hover over this and see the invoice itself, any relevant descriptions, and then for next steps, you'll notice that we can resync this bill, we can reject bill, and for admins only. So this is only going to be admins and owners. You can actually say, okay, Mary is a huge holdup. We really just need to pay this, so we're just going to initiate that payment. And so you can still override the approvals.